In September 2019, Kaya Roll had just started first grade in Orlando, Florida. She was a 6 year old outgoing black girl who, like any 6 year old, was still learning how to handle big emotions. So one day, when Kaya threw a tantrum in class and was sent to the principal's office, she accidentally struck school employees who tried to restrain her. That's when the police showed up. Kaya's tiny 6 year old wrists were zip tied together, and she was arrested and charged with misdemeanor battery. Kaya's story, which was published by the Southern Poverty Law Center earlier this year, is not an isolated incident. In fact, it's a routine part of the American education system. It's part of a larger issue, a phenomenon known as a school to prison pipeline, which disproportionately harms people of color and people with disabilities. For the safety and equality of these students, the US must divert and divest the school to prison pipeline by acknowledging its racist history and replacing severe punishments with safer practices. To deconstruct the school to prison pipeline, we must first understand what it is and where it came from. According to an article from Learning for Justice magazine, hundreds of school districts across the country employ discipline policies that push students out of the classroom and into the criminal justice system at alarming rates. In other words, the pipeline begins when teachers, administrators, and law enforcement discipline students for minor misbehaviors through severe tactics such as physical restraint, suspension, expulsion, and even arrest. The US public school system has enabled racist violence since its inception, from Indian boarding schools to segregation to Kaya Roll's arrest and beyond. In the 90s, a Princeton professor named John DiIulio escalated these issues by coining the term criminal super predators, claiming black youth are, quote, morally impoverished, which fed into laws such as Florida's tough love legislation that increased penalties for youth crime. And today, US politicians still push for increased police presence in schools, despite evidence that this is harmful to students of color and students with disabilities. There are countless studies that illustrate how the school to prison pipeline disproportionately affects students of color and students with disabilities. According to a nationwide study by the US Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, black students are 3.5 times more likely than white students to be suspended or expelled. 32% in youth juvenile detention centers have diagnosed disabilities, despite representing less than 10% of public school children. And black youth are prosecuted in adult court and detained in adult facilities 63% of the time, compared to 22% for white youth. To be clear, this disparity in punishment has nothing to do with morality, as DiIulio falsely suggested. It's an issue of racism and ableism that's regularly committed by school employees and law enforcement officers who have historically profiled and punished students of color and students with disabilities at much higher rates than white, able-bodied, and neurotypical children. And students don't shake these issues once they graduate. According to a study from the National Bureau of Economic Research, when students attend a school with higher rates of expulsion and suspension, they're 15 to 20% more likely to face arrest and incarceration as adults. As bleak as this issue has been historically, there are immediate steps that the US can take to diverge and divest the school to prison pipeline. In Florida, the Southern Poverty Law Center suggests making nonviolent offenses non-jailable for children, investing in community-based alternatives to youth incarceration, and raising the age of youth incarceration to at least 14 years old. For reference, in Minnesota, the minimum age of incarceration is already set at 14. but raising the age limit is not enough. Schools can also fight against the school to prison pipeline by compiling reports of suspensions, expulsions, and arrests, taking note of gender, race, and ability. Students can also create agreements with law enforcement, limiting police presence and arrest in schools, as well as train its teachers and administration on positive behavior supports for students. Today, Kaya Roll suffers from PTSD due to her arrest, and her family describes her as a totally different child to who she was before. This horrific mistreatment of students of color and with disabilities has to end. As Kaya's grandmother said, a 6-year-old throwing a tantrum is just a 6-year-old. There should not be any law in the book that allows a child to be arrested for being a child. Therefore, we must take action to protect children and dismantle the school to prison pipeline.